Hello and welcome to the Horti-Culturalists. I'm Stephen Ryan.
And I'm Matthew Lucas.
And we post a video every week. So why not hit subscribe and the alert button so that you'll keep up with our adventures weekly.
Indeed. And if you have a burning horticultural question for Mr. Ryan, put it in the comments below and we'll try and answer it in our Monday shorts.
Yes, so you can see us twice a week.
And a small housekeeping point, any plants that we mention in the video will be in the copy below. So if you can't see it, just hit read more and all of them will appear.
And of course, if you're an enthusiastic horticulturalist, as I'm sure you all are, maybe if you're an Australian resident, you might consider joining the Royal Horticultural Society of Victoria. They cover the whole country. They do all sorts of events. They have a fabulous journal that yours truly writes for. So consider the Royal Horticultural Society of Victoria.
And I heard the patron is very, very self-serving, narcissistic and a bit tricky.
Yeah, me. So what can one say?
Said with love, Stephen Ryan.
Yeah.
Well, this, I mean, say no more. What is our backdrop today, Stephen?
All right, well, we're at another one of Mount Macedon's magnificent, historically important homes.
Yes.
It's one called Duneira. It is about 36 acres of land. It's quite large, and the garden itself covers around about 16 acres. So we're talking about gardening on a grand scale.
Which is more sort of country estate-ish than large garden, isn't it?
It is really. And
because there's a working farm.
look, all these properties had to be self-sufficient. When you think about it, back to the 1870s, you couldn't just whip down to the milk bar to buy a bottle of milk. And even as a small child, I can remember the head gardener here would milk the milking cow Daisy every morning and every evening.
Daisy? No.
Yes, it was. And of course, it had a functioning vegetable garden, which was huge. So it was a sort of almost like a little fiefdom, you know, self-sufficient fiefdom. And so the staff would live out of the garden all year round. The owners would come up for the summer and expect strawberries on the table and sweet corn and all the other things that the gardener had grown. Of course, most owners had to accept the fact that the gardener was in charge, and so they often grew what they liked and the owner had to eat it.
There you are. Well, it sounds like bliss. So I think we should take a walk up the drive and just talk a little bit more about this garden before we get into the main subject of the video, which is
Bluebells.
Bluebells.
Yes.
You might get a hint that there's a few bluebells up the driveway.
Yes, certainly.
Let's go.
All right.
Well, Stephen, what an amazing garden. So what is the history of this place?
All right, well, Duneira was first selected in about 1870 by a gentleman by the name of Suetonius Officer. And he was a wealthy pastoralist.
There's a name.
Yes, it's a fabulous name, I love it. He was a wealthy pastoralist, and this was built to be his summer retreat. Most of the wealthy that lived up here actually didn't live up here, they lived somewhere else.
Yeah. And
this is where they came to escape the heat of summer on the plains or from Melbourne. So they were always just used as summer retreats. So he selected this land very, very cleverly, very canny Scot he was, because it's probably one of the highest properties on Mount Macedon. So it puts it up to getting on close to 1,000 feet above sea level. Or 1,000 metres, sorry, above sea level.
Which makes it chilly in winter.
Yes, it can get quite chilly in winter. But the site he selected is surprisingly gentle in its undulations and so forth. So you don't really have to be a mountain goat to walk around and enjoy this property. So he was very clever in the selection he made. And interestingly, of course, Suetonius wasn't the only one that built his summer retreat up here. And in fact, quite a number of Scots did in fact end up with properties in this area.
Because what's the other one we visited?
Well, there's Ardhilly,
Ardhilly,
which belonged to William McGregor, another great Scottish name. And so there were a number of them that did buy land up here and built their enormous summer retreat residences, which are really sort of a bit of a take of the idea of Darjeeling and those hill station gardens of northern India, where people would escape in the summer. And they'd come up here to play tennis, ride horses, have musical soirees, invite their wealthy friends around to show off what they've got.
Be still my beating heart.
So it would have been wonderful to be part of that era, I have to say. Having said that, though, if I'd been part of that era, I would probably be the head gardener, and so therefore wouldn't get to enjoy all of the things that the wealthy did.
True, true, true. Well, we are strolling down this incredible elm avenue, and the whole point of this video is bluebells.
Yep.
So we should probably take a stop and actually look at some of the elements of this amazing driveway.
What a good idea.
So what are the trees that this avenue is planted of, Stephen?
Well, a very obvious choice in its day, they're English elm.
Ah, yes.
So it would have been traditional, expected, and an obvious tree to plant. And I guess in hindsight, it's interesting because the trees of this particular species throughout Europe and North America have virtually disappeared because of Dutch elm disease, and we still have elm trees here in Victoria.
Very, very beautiful. Now, what is, I mean, I've obviously heard of Dutch elm disease, but what actually is it?
All right, it's a fungal disease that is spread by a bark-boring beetle. So the beetle bores into the bark and doesn't actually do any direct harm itself, other than the fact that it carries the fungal disease with it. It gets into the system of the plant and it very quickly kills the tree, although having said that, the root system tends to stay alive and then saplings will come up as suckers.
How odd. And
then of course the problem is as soon as the saplings get proper bark on them, then they can be reinfected by the beetle again and the whole process goes again. So unfortunately they've virtually disappeared in most parts of the world, except for here in Australia where we, as so far, touch wood, haven't actually got Dutch elm disease.
So for us to get Dutch elm disease, the beetle would have to be introduced somehow, which, you know, stranger things have happened in Australia.
Well, I actually have a sense that the vector's already here, but it hasn't brought the disease with it. So if some infected timber came in or what have you from overseas, then Dutch elm disease could then easily go mad in Australia. So at this stage we're hopefully safe, but sometimes it's a matter of when, not if. Long term, this could be a major issue.
But I guess too, I mean, in terms of the evolution of plants, that you'd imagine that the elms of Europe and North America are going to develop a resistance to the fungal attack.
At this stage they have found some trees that do seem to have resistance, and of course they're also trying to breed a hardier elm that is going to survive the problem. And so there is work being done to try and reintroduce English elm back into the landscapes of England and Europe. But at this stage it is only in its infancy, so there's still plenty of hurdles to jump and there might be a few stumbles to make on the way, unfortunately.
Well, let's hope that this avenue stays as superb as it is forever. But when do you think it was planted? Was this the first owner, the 1870s?
Yes, this would have been planted by Suetonius Officer back in the 1870s, and in itself raises a couple of interesting conundrums. The avenue then is 150 years old. The trees are surprisingly small in general for trees of this size. Any of our Australian viewers who have been to the Fitzroy Gardens in Melbourne will see trees of about the same era.
I was going to say, the elms in Melbourne are massive, huge trunks.
Now I'm not quite sure why they've never succeeded as well up here as they might. It could be altitude, being at about 3,000 or a little under 3,000 feet above sea level. Maybe the elms don't particularly like being this high up. It's the only thing I can think of. The soil should be fine, the precipitation should be fine. There's no real reason why the elms shouldn't have actually flourished here. But the choice wasn't a great one at the time, but now you have a historical conundrum you have to work with because it's what was authentically here, and the people like Heritage Victoria and other organisations would require you to replant with the same tree to keep it in historic context. And I'm sure there's a few more words I'll have to say about historic context and gardens as we go along.
Well, I think we might just go over there and just talk about some particular maintenance issues with this avenue. But which is kind of, it does link to our other avenue video where we talked to the head gardener at Cruden Farm, talking about that eucalypt avenue and I guess the pressure and stress responsibility of maintaining a historic avenue, but also what to do in terms of succession.
Yeah, well, exactly. And we've got an example just here.
Let's go. So obviously one of the things about avenues is that the trees die.
Yes, yes. Every tree is a finite resource. It's not going to last forever. And of course, because these trees are somewhat under stress already, they're not doing as well as they could do, they've got to start replacing dead trees. So they remove the stump of the tree and The people who run the property here have actually had young elm trees propagated from the old elms so that they've got the same genetic material.
Right.
And so as a tree collapses and requires replacement, they're putting in a young elm tree in its place. So it'll be interesting to see how that all pans out long term.
It will. I mean, when we spoke to Tim Entwistle, who then was the director of the Melbourne Botanic Gardens, his point was that they now have a filter that they put new planting through to see how it's going to adapt and manage with climate change.
Yes.
So you'd imagine in a garden like this, where for sort of, I guess, heritage and historical reasons, you've got to plant the same thing, might not end well.
No, and it may not, and therefore you would have to adapt and change and work out how you're going to deal with the issues.
You change species.
And in fact, you may well have to change species. And if you were going to do that, my attitude would be to try and pick a tree that had the visual aspects that the elm tree has. So something that looked sort of like an elm tree. Obviously it's not going to be one, but something that might well be more adapted to a changing climate, and that may be the way that things have to go long term.
Yeah, yeah. Well, it's very beautiful right now. That vista up the drive is just bucolic and stunning. So here's to the avenue lasting forever.
Yes, well, let's hope it lasts at least beyond us anyway.
Indeed. All right, Stephen, we are here to talk bluebells. This is the most magical spot. Tell me everything.
All right, well, for a start, bluebells, of course, aren't an Australian native.
No.
But they would have been something that the original owners would have wanted to have in their garden, because things like bluebells, primroses, snowdrops, all those sort of wildling plants of England would have reminded people of home. And because Mount Macedon is a climate that's not dissimilar, I guess, it's not quite as cold in the winter, but otherwise it has many similar characteristics, they would have felt pressured to, in fact, have these plants growing in their gardens. And of course, bluebells have just completely and utterly naturalised themselves in this garden, albeit they are managed as well. So if you're going to have something like this in a garden, it needs to be managed appropriately too.
Well, there you are. But let's get to basics. So what type of bluebell there is? Because there's a bit of controversy, isn't there, about the Spanish bluebell versus the British bluebell.
Yes.
Different habits.
Yes.
The Spanish one is more dominant, and it's
a more vigorous plant, yes, and they do breed together. My gut feeling is the bluebells we're looking at here in Duneira are actually probably of hybrid origin. And that would also suggest to you why there's so much diversity in them here. And you look at them closely, they're more likely to be a hybrid swarm because there's no sense of continuity. There's drooping bells, there's upright bells, there's short flower heads, there's long bells, squat bells, there's white bells, pink bells, and bluebells. I would say
it's a mixed bell experience.
Yeah, yes, exactly. So it's got almost all of the computations you could expect from bluebells, including non-blue ones. And so I'd say it's a hybrid swarm, and it would have been planted way back at Suetonius's time. So the 1870s, they would have started growing them here, and they've just been allowed to naturalise. They haven't been spread specifically. They've been spreading themselves, but then the management of them afterwards is allowing them to take over more and more ground.
So we've alluded to the fact that you came here as a child,
yes,
which is only moments ago.
Goodness gracious me, yes.
So looking at this drive now, what has changed in relation to the bluebells from your memories of the
garden?
All right,
well, when I was a small child, playing in the garden with the gardener's eldest son and daughter, we used to walk up and down this driveway, and I would say that the bluebells have taken over about twice the territory that they had when I was a small child in the 1960s and early 70s.
So you think they started at the top of the hill?
Yeah, they were definitely up to the top, and there was a big batch of crocuses there as well, the Dutch hybrid crocuses. Yeah. There's also lots of daffodils and other naturalising things, plenty of primroses. But the bluebells have been the dominant feature in this garden, and they have certainly got the vigour to have moved themselves well down.
But now, as we've just covered that they are not a native to Australia,
no,
and there are many weedy plants in Australia. Now, what is the status of the bluebell in our country then? Is it a weed? What's the story with it?
Well, Depends on who you talk to a certain extent. But having
a weed to plant in the wrong place.
Well, that's one of the definitions thereof. I would be more inclined to suggest that something like bluebells could be considered a weed if they've gone out into the wild. So if they're in uncultivated areas, in forests and what have you, then you've got to consider them to be proper weeds as such. So far, I haven't got any real evidence that bluebells have decided to move outside of the cultivated areas like this wonderful garden and some of the other gardens up here that have them growing.
Yeah.
And so I don't know. I don't think I would class them necessarily as weeds in the broader sense. Of course, in a home garden, because they have a large amount of foliage, they tend to swamp other things that they grow with. Many a home gardener will tell you that their bluebells are a weed. So it depends on your definition.
Because there are lots of bulb species that have become weedy, introduced bulb species in Australia.
Yep.
I mean, weirdly up here, Acapanthus being one of them.
Yeah, and it's not even, well, strictly speaking, it's probably not actually all that bulbous, but there's South African bulbs have actually become far more of a problem in Australia than most other groups of bulbs have. So European and Mediterranean bulbs don't seem to have taken off in the same way, but Spiraxes and Ixias and Freesias and Watsonias, I mean, there's innumerable South African bulbs that have become quite pestilent and got out into the wild, both in agricultural areas and in what should be natural forest areas.
I have to say, I was a child in Perth in Western Australia, and the freesias there, because it's a very Mediterranean climate, were stunning in spring, because the fragrance, literally, there'd be fields of freesias everywhere. It's gorgeous. Anyway, another question then is, you mentioned this before, but there are like 3 distinct colours. There's a blue, there's a white, and there's a pink. What is the origin of that? Why are they so variable?
Well, because these would have been hybrids in the first place, so they would have Spanish and English bluebell blood in them, or sap, as the case may be.
Armada plants.
Yeah, and so white and pink versions of bluebells have shown up in cultivation for centuries. In fact, double-flowered ones, all sorts of weird and wonderful varieties have shown up, some of which kept going, others faded out over a period of time. Certainly double ones are an issue because they tend to not set seed, so therefore they're less likely to proliferate. But because of the hybrid swarm that it is, the pink and white ones were invariably going to show up. The blue's always going to be the dominant colour, it's the more robust of them. But even in the blues, if you look at them closely, there's quite deep blues, there's pale soft blues, so there's quite a variation even within that.
I mean, they're all purple, none of them are blue, but anyway.
Oh, we're not going to go into that. I have to say, it doesn't sound as good when you say purple bells.
No, it doesn't. All right, well, I think let's go and talk a bit more about achieving this and maintaining it, and maybe companion planting.
Yeah, all right, good idea. Well, if you look closely here, you can see that the foliage here is quite dense and it tends to flop out over the ground. So only the strongest things are going to be able to compete with the bluebells in this sort of habitat. So hence they've taken over virtually the whole area. The only other things I've seen in here that other plants growing, apart from some of the rough grasses that are coming up through it, are some of the other bulbous things. So daffodils, crocuses and sundry things like that. They come up a little earlier, so they get a chance to do their thing before the bluebells, which are really high to late spring flowering, do their thing. And then of course, once they're over, well, that's it for the season.
Well, this is a great spot for you, Stephen Ryan, to demonstrate how do you maintain bluebells that have a natural, there's kookaburras,
Yes.
they want to join in, that have a natural tendency to spread.
All right, well they do. They'll self-seed themselves and they will keep marching forward. So if you want to manage your bluebells, regular mowing around the outskirts of the area will keep them more or less in check. They'll keep trying to move sideways, but that will stop them from seeding further and further out. So regularly mow around the batches, and of course, once the bluebells are over and the leaves have died down, you have to allow the seed to drop if you want that natural regeneration to keep going. So you've got to leave them intact long enough so that the seed can then shed, and then you send the mower through, and a lot of these areas then just become part of the lawn again.
Right. So there are 2 points when you'd mow. You'd mow either to stop them spreading, or once they're dead and done, just to clean up the area again.
Yeah, exactly, because you wouldn't want to leave it full of dead forget-me-nots and bluebells and things all year round. It would just look awful.
Forgotten forget-me-nots.
Yeah, so what happens is it just becomes part of the lawn later on. So it looks like a garden bed at the moment.
So here's the thing then, I guess we saw lots of genetic variation. So is the best way for you to encourage a bluebell spot to spread by seed, or does the bulb actually spread itself as well?
Well, the bulbs do multiply. So you will find an individual bluebell will eventually make a small clump.
Yeah.
So the bulbs do multiply, but obviously seed is by far the quickest and best spreading technique of the bluebell. So I guess if your bluebell patch has got as big as you ever want it, the bulbs dividing only sort of grow against each other. So I guess you could go through and take them down before they're allowed to go to seed if you wanted to control them. The kookaburras are having a wonderful time here today.
That is hilarious.
It sounds like a Tarzan movie.
It does. And what is the sort of the life cycle of a bluebell then from seed? How long would it take before its flowering size?
All right, well, if you sowed seed or allowed seed to shed, you would expect bluebells within, say, 3 years. So they'd need to go through at least a couple of seasons to start building up a bit of oomph, a bit of speed.
Technical term.
Yes, and then after that period they should start to flower. And of course the same bulb will flower year after year after year for a long, long time. I don't quite know how long a bluebell bulb will last, but certainly for quite a long time. And in the meantime it will also be multiplying, so you'll end up with a thicket where you started off with one.
Fabulous. Well, I know you said that the bluebells can be quite dominating, particularly when the leaves have fallen.
Yeah.
But there are a few other things managing to coexist.
Yes, there are. And so there are some plants that probably evolved with bluebells in the wild, in fact, that have also managed to hold their own in the bluebell woods here.
Yes.
And the classic example would be the English primrose, Primula vulgaris, with its little pale lemon flowers in the late winter, which of course is just greenery now. So again, it would have come up well before the bluebells were well underway, so it would have had a head start on them. Another plant that has done quite well with them is the lawn daisy, Bellis perennis. It seems to hold its own amongst the bluebells, and it's still there later in the year when the bluebells are down. And of course, forget-me-nots. Who doesn't love a forget-me-not except when you've got to pull them out, because they have the most dreadful sticky seeds that stick all over you when you pull them out.
Where are they from? Now, I guess the important thing to note is that all of these things are introduced.
Oh yes, yes, they're all exotic plants, all European in origin, and would have all grown in much the same habitat. So forget-me-nots, bluebells, primroses, all those plants would have all come from a similar sort of climatic zone, in fact probably cohabitated together, and hence they managed to do so here as well.
I must say, I mean, it looks beautiful here, but it is, when you actually stop and think that all of those things are introduced, and a lot of them have actually gone quite feral in Australia. Not so much primroses, because they do need the damp and the cold.
Yeah, the primroses are unlikely to get a particular hold on the wild, but the other plants certainly can. You will see forget-me-nots wild, and of course they get around because of their sticky seeds. So if an animal wanders through, it picks up the seeds of the forget-me-nots when they're ripe, and it will carry the seeds all over the place. In fact, I could also be one of those animals as well, because I have come out covered in forget-me-not seeds when I've been pulling them out. And in fact, I've decided probably the only way to pull out forget-me-nots when they're finished is to do it naked.
That's a very different channel, Stephen.
Yes, that is a different channel, but I might add at least
we'll put the subscription below.
Yes, you don't come out covered all over your jumper or your coat with forget-me-not seeds.
Okay, we're perhaps not recommending people should...
Oh, no, I would. I'd recommend it. Why not indeed?
Go naked weeding.
Yes.
Well, there you go. But I must say, though, that I guess if you're in an area where these things aren't posing a risk, to plant all of those different sort of wildflowers essentially in Europe together, it is a beautiful sight to behold, and unusual in Australia.
Oh yes, you would probably not find anywhere else in Australia, with particularly the bluebells, on this sort of scale.
No.
I mean, it is quite remarkable. The driveway is about 370 yards long, and a good 2/3 of the driveway is bluebells, and it's just remarkable.
It is. Well, I think we should talk a bit more about the driveway.
Oh, what a good idea.
Well, this is such a beautiful driveway, Stephen. I mean, I guess it's kind of obvious, but what was the point of such a long drive?
Well, of course, you had to show off. So that was part of it. So
status anxiety.
Yeah, so the long driveway would have built anticipation as visitors arrived, I guess back in those days in their horse and cart or on horseback. And of course you can't see the house from the bottom of the driveway. So you would come in, and if you'd not been to Duneira before, you would come up the driveway anticipating to see some
Chatsworth,
sort of... yes.
Blenheim Palace.
Or perhaps Vaux-le-Vicomte even, who knows? It could have been anything. So it was to show off the wealth of the owners, be a grand entrance for visitors to come, and with the sudden evolving of or sudden arrival at the house as you come around the top corner of the driveway, so that there was that sense of surprise, and lots of oohing and ahhing would have been going on at about that time. And then the driveway sweeps around in front of the house where you would have got out of your buggy, and then I'm assuming your driver would have then taken it away and stabled it and dealt with things whilst you were having a lovely afternoon.
Now, you mentioned the fact that it probably has changed from the original intent. So what do you think has changed from, what's his name? Suetonius?
Suetonius officer, yes.
From his intention.
All right, well, he wanted the grand Scottish estate look,
Yeah.
and the biggest change that's been wrought on the driveway is in fact the planting of lots of rhododendrons. So when you go down the driveway, you're enclosed by the avenue of trees, but you're also enclosed by rows of rhododendrons down both sides. Now, they would not have been his original intention, because they then close you in so that you can't look out through the sweeping lawns at the rest of the estate. So they would have probably been put in by the second owners, the Reeds, although I think that the top side of the driveway may well have been done by the third owner, which was Betty Orcock nee Nicholas, whose father was G.R. Nicholas, who made a fortune out of selling aspirin.
Aspirin? Is this the origin of the Nicholson building in Melbourne?
Yes, and he bought this property for his eldest daughter, Elizabeth, as a wedding present.
Lucky Elizabeth.
Yeah, so she had this property up until I was about 17 or 18. So I grew up with her being the owner, and she had her house in Melbourne, and she had her place in Holland, and she had her place in America, and they just spent their whole life tootling around, which was fabulous for them.
Lucky them. Well, they have left us the legacy of this beautiful driveway and the rhododendrons. It's interesting because the rhododendrons are beautiful, but it would be a very different feel if you did see, because you really can't see the expanse of the garden at the moment.
No, you can't, and that's one of those conundrums that people find themselves in when they're dealing with an important historical garden. If you were to take it back to exactly what it was in its early days, I mean, in a sense, quite literally, you should take all the trees out and plant saplings, because that's what would have been here. So there would have been just these little tiny trees. So of course, gardens get layered upon layered upon layered from different owners having their own ideas and their own taste in things. And I know I had a very interesting conversation with somebody from Heritage Victoria in the garden here many years ago. I had sold one of the previous owners a dawn redwood, Metasequoia glyptostroboides, for those who want a botanical name. And it's now a substantial tree down the driveway, which we may visit at some other time in one of our trips back to this garden. And they said, oh, that'll have to go. And I said, I beg your pardon, it's a beautiful tree, it fits in with the other conifers that are in the garden superbly. And they said, yes, but it wasn't discovered till the 1940s. So it wasn't authentic of the era.
Oh, but that's ridiculous.
Well, as I pointed out to them, if Suetonius officer had had a dawn redwood available to him in the 1870s, it would have been here. Absolutely, definitely would have been planted.
But you can't pickle gardens in aspic. I mean, this is one of the things when a garden comes out of individual ownership. So this garden is now managed by a trust. Is that like Vides Sackwell West's garden at Sissinghurst? You know, the whole thing is that it can become institutionalized and fixed rather than evolving and ever growing.
Yes,
literally.
And of course some of those gardens that are open to the public on a regular basis are forced to actually make changes like widening paths, putting down hard surfaces so people don't trip and hurt themselves. So sometimes you have to make those adjustments for the public if you're going to open it fully to the public. Having said that, this one isn't open to the public on a regular basis.
Well then, if you're thinking of creating your own driveway, you need to think about drama, hiding the house, appropriate trees for your climate, and what to underplant it with.
And that's all been done with aplomb in this garden, I have to say.
Not plums, elms. Anyway.
Yes.
Well, let's take one last look at this gorgeous vista.
It's wonderful.
Well, Stephen, yet again, you have opened the doors to a private garden. Thank you.
Well, it's been a pleasure, and it's a garden that I have a long history with, so it's lovely to come back and visit again.
Yes, and we are going to make a series of films here, so we'll put them all together in a playlist so you can see and find out more about this beautiful garden.
Yeah. And I'd like to thank the trustees of the property, because it is under a trust now, and of course the head gardener Pip, who's been a friend of mine for many years, for allowing us to come in and enjoy this wonderful idyllic place.
Absolutely. Now we'll put a link to the website below for the garden. It is open occasionally and to private groups, but you do need to check the website to find out all those details, so we'll link that below. And there is in fact an annual Bluebell festival here, so if you happen to be in the Mount Macedon area in late spring, definitely check the website out and come and have a look.
Oh, definitely worth it.
Absolutely.
I mean, we've had it all to ourselves today.
And you'll see nothing like it in this country anyway. But if you want to see something else like it that's not like it, you'll have to subscribe and join our continuing journey. We post every Friday.
And don't forget, if you've got a burning horticultural question that you'd like me to answer for you, put it in the comments below. Remember to tell me where you're from so that I can get context, and I'm very happy to answer it on our Monday 60-second shorts.
There you go. But from the wonderful Bluebell walk of Duneira, we'll look forward to seeing you next week.
Bye all.